It is midnight in the Ashworth University Library when Professor Soren Vask catches a scent that stops him dead between the ancient history stacks. Sweet, warm, unmistakably Omega, unmistakably hers. He has spent the entire semester pretending Neve Calloway does not affect him, pretending his hands do not grip the lectern harder every time she walks into his lecture hall. But tonight, alone in a building that should be empty, her slick is threading through the shelves like a confession she cannot take back. And when he rounds the corner and finds her curled over her laptop, trembling, wide-eyed, and soaking through her clothes, he says the only thing left to say. Your thesis is due tomorrow, Omega. Before we dive in, tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. The semester started with a name on a roster, Neve Calloway. Soren read it 3 times, sitting in his office with the door closed and a cup of black coffee going cold on his desk. He did not know her yet, did not know anything about her except that she had transferred in from West Haven College mid-year, that her academic record was spotless, and that her advisor had written a recommendation letter that used the word brilliant 4 times in 2 paragraphs. He set the roster down and rubbed his temples. He was 34 years old. He had been teaching advanced European history at Ashworth for 6 years. He had published 2 books, chaired a departmental review committee, and turned down a tenure-track offer at a more prestigious institution because he liked the quiet here, the smallness of it. The stone buildings with their ivy-covered walls and narrow hallways that smelled like old paper and wood polish. He was also an alpha, not the kind who announced it. Soren was tall, broad, his jaw hard-cut, and his eyes a gray so pale they looked almost silver in certain light. His dark hair was always slightly too long, curling at the collar of whatever button-down he was wearing, and his voice carried the low, quiet authority of a man who never needed to raise it. But he kept his pheromones locked down. He wore suppressant patches on both wrists, used scent-neutralizing soap, and maintained the kind of controlled, measured distance that people mistook for coldness. It was not coldness. It was discipline. He had watched other alphas lose themselves, watched colleagues cross lines they could not uncross, careers and reputations disintegrate because someone could not keep their biology in check. He had sworn he would never be one of them. For 6 years, he had kept that promise without effort. Then Neve Calloway walked into his Monday morning lecture. She was late. She slipped in through the side entrance while he was mid-sentence about the Treaty of Westphalia, and she moved so quietly that most of the 200 students did not notice her at all. Soren noticed. He noticed because the moment the door opened, something shifted in the air. Something subtle and immediate that bypassed his brain and went straight into the oldest part of him. His nostrils flared before he could stop them. His fingers on the lectern tightened. She was small, 5'3", maybe 5'4", with dark auburn hair pulled into a messy knot at the back of her head. She was wearing an oversized gray sweater that slipped off one shoulder and jeans with holes at the knees. Her skin was pale, dusted with freckles across her nose and collarbones, and her eyes, when she finally looked up and accidentally met his gaze across the hall, were a deep, startling green. Omega. He knew it instantly. Not because of anything she did. He knew because his body knew. Something ancient and chemical recognized her on a frequency beyond conscious thought. Her scent hit him next. Faint. She was on good suppressants. But underneath the chemical flatness, there it was. Warm vanilla. Rain-soaked earth. Something sweeter underneath that made the base of his spine tighten and his jaw clench hard enough that the muscle jumped beneath his skin. He looked away. He continued his lecture. He talked about sovereignty and nation-states and the end of the 30 Years' War, and his voice did not waver once. But his hands did not unclench from the lectern for the remaining 47 minutes. After class, she came to the front. Students filed out. The noise of 200 people gathering bags slowly faded as the room emptied. Soren gathered his notes, stacking papers he did not need to stack, buying time. She stopped 3 feet from the lectern. Professional distance. Professor Vask? I am Neve Calloway. I just transferred in. I wanted to introduce myself and ask if there is any additional reading I should do to catch up on the first 3 weeks. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. She was gripping the strap of her bag with both fists, knuckles white, and she was not breathing through her nose. She could smell him too. Up close, she was worse. The freckles were darker than he had thought, scattered across her cheekbones, and her eyes had flecks of gold near the pupils. She smelled like she was trying very hard not to smell like anything at all. And underneath that effort, she smelled like everything he had ever wanted. I will email you a supplementary reading list tonight. Check the course portal as well. Thank you, Professor. She turned and left. He watched her until she disappeared through the side door. Then he stood alone for another full minute, breathing through his mouth. That night in his apartment, he stood in the shower with the water turned cold and his forehead pressed against the tile. This was a problem. The weeks that followed were an exercise in controlled devastation. Neve sat in the 4th row, left side, every Monday and Wednesday. She took notes in a leather-bound journal. With a pen she occasionally pressed against her lower lip when she was thinking. She raised her hand to ask questions that were perfectly articulated challenges to whatever framework he had just presented, and she did it with genuine intellectual curiosity that made him want to cancel class and debate her for 3 hours. She came to office hours. The first time, she knocked on his open door and asked if he had a moment to discuss her essay topic. She sat in the chair across from his desk and presented her thesis with the clarity of someone defending a doctoral dissertation. The conversation lasted 45 minutes. By the end, he had recommended 6 additional sources, drawn a timeline on his whiteboard, and forgotten entirely that the closed door behind her was inappropriate. She reminded him when she stood to leave. The movement shifted the air, and a wave of her scent reached him, warm and sweet, and so potently omega that his vision narrowed for a half-second. Thank you, Professor. That was incredibly helpful. He nodded. He did not trust his voice. She left. He opened the window and sat in the November cold for 20 minutes. The second office hours visit was worse. She came in the rain. Her hair was down, wet, and darkened to a deep copper that clung to her neck and collarbones, and her sweater was damp and her cheeks were flushed from the cold. She sat down and said, I think I need to change my essay topic. Why? Because I started researching and I went down a path that I cannot seem to stop following. And now my thesis has turned into something much bigger than a 5,000-word paper. Tell me. She told him. She talked for 20 minutes about the intersection of religious persecution and economic migration in 17th century Europe, and her eyes lit up the way they did in lecture when something clicked, and her hands moved when she talked, tracing the shape of her arguments in the air. Soren sat behind his desk and listened to every word, and fell in love with her mind so completely and so irrevocably that he knew, with absolute certainty, that he was in serious trouble. That sounds like a thesis-length project, he said. If you are interested, I can supervise it as an independent study. The words came out before he could stop them. Her eyes widened. Really? You clearly have the capacity and the drive. The topic is strong. It would be a waste to compress it into 5,000 words. I would like that very much, Professor. I will file the paperwork tomorrow. She left. He closed his office door, pressed his back against it, and exhaled. The independent study turned controlled devastation into sustained torture. They met once a week, Thursdays at 4, in his office with the door open. Always open. He had made that rule for himself, and he did not break it. She brought her research. He reviewed it. They discussed it. She argued with him, politely but ferociously, and he argued back. And somewhere in those arguments, he discovered that her mind complemented his so perfectly that their conversations felt less like supervision and more like a duet neither of them had rehearsed. He learned things about her. She drank coffee black but put honey in her tea. She had a habit of tucking her hair behind her left ear when nervous. She bit the inside of her cheek when concentrating. Her laughter, when he said something unexpectedly dry, was quiet and surprised and hit him somewhere behind his ribs. She was 23. She had transferred because West Haven lost funding for her scholarship. She worked 2 jobs and maintained a perfect grade average. She lived alone in a studio apartment off campus, and she did not have family nearby. She was, underneath the brilliance and the composure and the fierce independence, profoundly alone. He recognized that loneliness. It lived in him too. November became December.
The campus emptied for winter break and filled again in January. Neve walked back into his lecture hall tanned and rested in a white blouse that made her freckles stand out, and she smiled at him. Not the polite, professional smile, a real smile, small and warm, directed at him specifically. It lasted only a second before she caught herself. It was enough to ruin him. He went home that night and sat in his dark living room. The answer to what he was going to do about this was nothing. She was his student. He was her professor. Nothing. He noticed the change in her scent around March, a richness, a depth that had not been there before. Her suppressants were working less effectively, as if her body was fighting them, overriding them. He knew what that meant. Her biology was responding to a compatible alpha. Her body had identified him as a match and was doing everything in its power to signal that. He drafted the transfer email 3 times, typed Professor Halloran's name, wrote a polite request citing scheduling conflicts. He deleted it every time, because transferring her would mean not seeing her every Thursday at 4. And he had become addicted to Thursdays at 4. Addicted to the way she leaned forward when excited about a discovery. Addicted to the way she said his name, Professor Vask, with that slight catch before the V. He kept the supervision. It was the most selfish thing he had ever done. April arrived. Her thesis was taking shape, meticulous, beautifully argued, already better than most doctoral work. She was going to graduate with honors, get into any graduate program she wanted, leave Ashworth, and do extraordinary things. He was going to stand in his empty office on Thursdays at 4 and remember what it felt like to be near her. Until the night in the library. A Thursday in late April. Her thesis due the next morning. She had been working on revisions for 2 weeks, barely sleeping, running on caffeine, and the kind of obsessive perfectionism that Soren recognized because he suffered from it himself. He was in the library because he always came at night, a habit born of insomnia. He was on the 3rd floor, in the medieval history section, when the scent hit him. It came through the shelves, thick, sweet, devastatingly potent. Not faint, not muted by suppressants. Full, undiluted omega scent, the kind that only happened when suppressants had been overwhelmed completely. And it was hers. His hand froze on the spine of the book. His entire body went rigid, every muscle locking, and something deep in his chest that he had spent 6 years keeping silent opened its eyes. He followed the scent through the stacks, through medieval history, past early modern Europe, around the corner into comparative politics, and left toward the back alcove where the study carrels were tucked behind shelves on 3 sides. He found her in the last carrel. She was curled in the wooden chair with her laptop open. Her hair was down, tangled, falling across her face. She was wearing leggings and an oversized flannel. Her hands were trembling on the keyboard. She was soaked. The sheen on her skin,
the way the flannel clung to her back, the wet press of her leggings against her thighs. Her scent was everywhere, filling the alcove, so thick and sweet that his teeth ached and the alpha in him strained against its restraints with a force that nearly buckled his knees. She looked up. Her eyes were glassy, dilated, the green almost swallowed by her pupils, and her lips were parted and her chest was heaving. Professor Vask. Her voice broke on his name. He stood at the entrance to the alcove. He did not step closer. Your thesis is due tomorrow, Omega. She whimpered. Small. Wrecked. I know. I came here to finish revisions and I was fine. I was fine until an hour ago and then my suppressants just stopped working. I took the right dosage.
I do not understand why they failed tonight of all nights. He understood. Her body had been fighting the suppressants for weeks. Tonight, alone in a building where his scent lingered in the hallways and the stacks and the chair he sat in every night, her biology had finally won. Because of him. Neve. It was the first time he had ever said her first name out loud. He had thought it hundreds of times, but never let it past his lips. It came out low, rough. She shivered, full body. A fresh wave of her scent poured into the air, and he had to close his eyes. I need to get you home. Can you walk? She laughed, ragged, wet, somewhere between hysterical and heartbroken. I do not think so. He opened his eyes. She was looking at him with so much raw need that it stripped away every pretense. Professor, do not call me that right now. He passed a hand over his face. I did not mean it like that. I just need you to not call me that while you smell like this, because I am trying very hard to be the person I am supposed to be, and you calling me professor is making that extremely difficult. Silence. Then, very quietly, Soren. He felt it in his spine, in his ribs, in the base of his skull where instinct lived. I am going to call a car. Get you home. Tomorrow, after you submit your thesis, we are going to talk about this. But not tonight. Why not tonight? Because tonight you are in a compromised state and I will not take advantage of that. Not even if you ask me to. Not even if I want to so badly that I cannot think straight. What if I have been wanting this since the first day? What if the compromised state is not the reason? It does not matter. Not tonight. He took one step into the alcove. Just one. Close enough that her scent hit him without buffer, and the world narrowed to nothing but her. It matters to me too, he said, and his voice was so low it was barely audible. More than you know. More than I have any right to feel. But you are my student, and your thesis is due in 9 hours, and you deserve better than a dark library at midnight with a man who should have transferred your supervision months ago. Why did you not? He was quiet for a long moment. Because I could not make myself give up the only excuse I had to be in a room with you. The honesty hung between them. She closed her laptop. I can finish revisions at home. After I submit the thesis, I am no longer your student. He felt those words land in his chest. I know. Then we talk. Then we talk. He called the car. He stood 6 feet from her while they waited, hands in his pockets, jaw locked, his entire body vibrating with the effort of not touching her. She stood by the circulation desk with her laptop clutched to her chest, and neither of them spoke. The car arrived. She walked to it. She opened the door. Then she turned back. For the record, my suppressants did not fail randomly. My body has been trying to tell me something for months. I just was not brave enough to listen until tonight.
She got in. It drove away. Soren stood on the library steps in the dark and breathed. He went back inside, back to the third floor, back to the alcove where her scent still hung in the air. He sat in her chair and pressed his palms flat against the desk and let himself feel it. Every denied impulse, every swallowed instinct, every night he had spent alone thinking about exactly this. He sat there until 2 a.m. Then he went home, and he did not sleep. The thesis arrived in his inbox at 8:47 a.m. He read every word, all 62 pages. Exceptional, meticulous, original, beautifully argued. She had synthesized primary sources in 3 languages and challenged 2 established academic positions with evidence so thorough it was almost aggressive. He submitted his evaluation by noon. Distinction, the highest grade he could give. Then he sat at his desk and waited. The email came at 12:34.
Professor Vask, my thesis has been submitted and graded. I am officially no longer your student. I will be at the library tonight. Same alcove, same time. He typed 1 word. Good. The hours between noon and midnight were the longest of his life. He taught his afternoon seminar without remembering a word. He went home. He showered. He changed into a black button-down rolled to the elbows and dark trousers, and he did not analyze why he was thinking about what to wear. He arrived at the library at 11:45. The building was dark, empty. The night security guard waved him through. He took the stairs to the 3rd floor, walked through the stacks. Medieval history, early modern Europe, comparative politics. He turned the corner into the alcove. She was there. She was sitting on the desk this time. Her legs dangled over the edge. She was wearing a simple black dress that ended above her knees, and her hair was down and her feet were bare, shoes placed neatly beneath the desk. She was not wearing suppressants. He knew it the moment her scent reached him. Full, rich, unfiltered. It poured off her skin and wrapped around him, and every single boundary he had built over 6 years dissolved. You came. You knew I would. He stopped at the entrance. Tonight, the power dynamic that had defined them for 8 months no longer existed. Tonight, she was not his student, and he was not her professor, and the only thing between them was 5 feet of air and the truth. Your thesis was extraordinary. She smiled, that small, warm, devastating smile. Thank you. But I did not come here to talk about my thesis. I came to tell you that I have been in love with you since the 2nd week of the fall semester. Since you argued with me about the Peace of Augsburg for 45 minutes. Every Thursday at 4 has been the best hour of my week for 8 months. I have done everything right, and I do not want to do the right thing anymore. I want to do the true thing.
Her eyes filled, not with sadness, with relief so enormous it looked like it might pull her apart.
Come here. He crossed the 5 feet in 2 strides. He did not touch her, not yet. Close enough that her knees brushed his thighs. Since the first lecture, she said. Since you stopped mid-sentence when I walked in and your eyes found me across 200 people. I felt you notice me. Every day after that. Sitting in your class, smelling you and pretending I did not. It was the sweetest agony. I wrote my best work because of you. Every page was a love letter I could not send. So I put all of it into the research and the arguments. He raised his hand. Slowly. She leaned into his touch before it arrived, tilting her face toward his palm. His fingers made contact with her jaw, and the sound she made was so quiet and so devastated that it reverberated in his chest. He kissed her. Not gently. The moment his mouth touched hers, the plan for something slow evaporated.
She tasted like honey and coffee and need, and her lips parted, and the sound she made against his mouth shattered something in him. His hand slid into her hair, gripping, tilting her head back. Her hands fisted his shirt, pulling him closer. Her knees parted, and he stepped between them, and the contact of his body against hers sent a jolt through both of them. She kissed him back with equal desperation. Her hands slid up his chest, over his shoulders, into his hair, and she pulled him down, and the sound in the back of her throat was primal and omega and purely Neve. He pulled back an inch, just enough to breathe. "We cannot do this here," she gasped. "My apartment is 12 minutes away. I have a car." They walked through the dark library in silence, down the stairs, past the circulation desk, out into the night. He opened the passenger door for her. He sat behind the wheel, and for a moment they just sat in the dark. She reached across the center console and took his hand. Her fingers were small.
Her grip was strong. She laced her fingers through his, and he felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for months. He drove the 12 minutes with one hand on the wheel and one hand holding hers. Her apartment was small, a studio. Books everywhere, stacked on the desk, piled on the nightstand, lined along the windowsill. She closed the door. The click of the lock was the loudest sound in the world. The only light came from the street lamp outside, casting the room in pale orange that turned her hair to copper and her skin to gold. He reached for her. She came to him. This time the kiss was slow. He took her face in both hands and kissed her the way he had wanted to since the first day. Her upper lip, her lower lip, the corner of her mouth, the spot below her ear where her pulse was hammering. She breathed his name, and her hands went to his shirt. She undid the buttons one by one, each one freed with the careful focus she brought to difficult primary sources. The shirt fell open. Her palms pressed flat against his chest, and the touch of her skin on his was so overwhelming that his breath caught audibly, and he felt her smile against his mouth. "Your heart is pounding," she whispered. "It has been pounding since September." She pushed the shirt off his shoulders. It dropped. Her hands explored him with wonder. The breadth of his shoulders, the hard planes of his chest, the firm terrain of his stomach that contracted under her touch. He caught her hands. "My turn." She nodded. He reached for the zipper at the back of her dress, drew it down slowly. The sound of it was obscene in the quiet. The fabric loosened, and he slid it down her arms, over her hips, until it pooled at her feet. The freckles that started at her collarbones and scattered down, the curve of her waist, the way her chest rose and fell with breaths that were too fast. "You are staring." "I have been staring since September. I am just not pretending otherwise anymore." "Then stop pretending entirely." He walked her backward, 3 steps to the bed. Her knees hit the edge and she sat, looking up at him. And from this angle, with the streetlight painting her in gold and shadow, she looked like something from a painting he would never be worthy of. He knelt. He dropped to his knees on the hardwood floor and put his hands on her knees and looked up at her. "Tell me what you want." "You. All of you. Everything you have been holding back." He pressed his mouth to the inside of her knee. He kissed a path up the inside of her thigh, slow and deliberate, and her hands found his hair and tightened, and the sounds she made grew louder with every inch. He learned her body the way he learned a new text, slowly, attentively. He found the places that made her gasp, the places that made her arch, the places that made her grip his hair and say his name. She came apart with a cry muffled against her forearm, her whole body drawing tight and then releasing, trembling, her hips lifting off the bed. He did not stop. He brought her there again and again
patient and thorough, until she was boneless and gasping and flushed from her cheeks to her navel. Only then did he rise. "Come here," she whispered. "Come here, Alpha." She had never called him that, not once in 8 months. It had always been Professor, then Soren, never Alpha. He moved over her. She pulled him down and the kiss was fierce and graceless. Then there was nothing between them, just skin on skin and heat on heat, and the ancient unstoppable gravity of an Alpha and an Omega who had found each other. He settled between her thighs and paused, looked at her. Her eyes were clear, present. This was not heat-driven desperation. This was a woman who knew exactly what she wanted and was choosing it. "I love you," he said. It came out with the inevitability of breathing. Tears slipped from her eyes into her hair. "I love you too. I have loved you since the Peace of Augsburg." He laughed.
Quietly, the kind that borders on tears. Then he joined her, slow. So slow it was almost cruel. She gasped, and her fingers dug into his shoulders, and her back arched, and he watched her face through all of it, cataloging her responses with obsessive attention. She was warm and encompassing, and the feel of her around him was so overwhelming that he had to stop and press his forehead to hers and breathe. "You okay?" she whispered. "I am going to need a moment, or I am going to embarrass myself." She laughed, the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He moved. She moved with him. They found a rhythm that was less about technique and more about communication, a slow, deep cadence that built and built until she was clutching him and her nails scored lines down his back, and every stroke pushed sounds from her throat that he wanted to remember forever. He could feel the pressure building, the biological imperative that had no place in polite conversation and every place in this bed with this woman. "Soren." She gripped his face, looked into his eyes. "I want it. I want all of it." "Are you sure?" "I have never been more sure of anything." He drove deep. Her head fell back. Her body tightened around him, clenching, pulling, demanding, and he felt himself swell and lock, and the world went white. They came together. He buried his face in her neck, and she wrapped her arms around him, and they shattered in unison, wave after wave, locked together in the most intimate way two people could be. She was crying, and he was shaking, and he pressed his mouth to the scent gland on her neck, and she said yes before he could ask. He bit down. She cried out, not in pain, in completion. The forging of a bond that rewrote the chemistry of both their bodies in a single, irreversible moment. He felt her in his blood, in his thoughts, in the marrow of his bones, constant and present and essential. It felt like coming home. They lay tangled together while his body held them joined. She was curled against his chest, her fingers tracing patterns on his skin. The bond hummed between them, newly formed and already so strong it felt ancient. "You bonded me," she murmured. "I did. That is permanent." "It is." "Good." He kissed her forehead. "Your thesis was still due tomorrow," he said. She laughed against his chest. "It was due 9 hours ago. I submitted it at 8:47. I gave you a distinction. I earned it." "You did." "What happens now, Soren?" "Now we figure out the rest. But not tonight." "What about tonight?" "Tonight, I hold you. And in the morning, you show me where you keep the coffee."
She pressed her lips to the center of his chest, right over his heart. Deal. She fitted against him, her back to his chest, his arm around her waist, her hand covering his where it rested against her stomach. Soren? I am glad my suppressants failed. They did not fail. Your body chose. She laced her fingers through his. My body chose right. He pressed his mouth to the back of her neck where the bond mark was fresh and warm. He did not sleep, not because of insomnia. He did not sleep because she was in his arms, and the bond was singing in his veins, and the night was quiet, and the street lamp was painting her in gold, and he did not want to miss a single second of this, the first night of every night, for the rest of his life. Before dawn, she murmured something in her sleep. He listened closer. Soren. Just his name, spoken with unconscious tenderness that could not be faked. He closed his eyes. He held her tighter. Outside, the campus was still. The library stood dark and quiet, its shelves holding 2 million volumes, and none of them contained a story as good as this. Morning came slow and gold through the window of Neve Calloway's studio apartment. Soren Vask had not slept. He had held her through the remaining hours of the night, his arm around her waist, his chest against her back,
The bond mark on her neck warm against his lips every time he pressed his mouth to it. She had slept deeply, completely. The kind of sleep that only came from a body that had finally stopped fighting what it needed. He had spent those hours thinking, not about regret. There was none, not a single molecule of it in his blood. What he had done, bonding her, claiming her, saying the words he had kept locked behind his teeth for 8 months, was the most honest thing he had ever done, the truest act of his life. He was thinking about what came next. The university had a policy. Of course it did. Ashworth had a formal disclosure process for relationships between faculty and students, even former students, if the relationship had originated during the period of academic supervision. He would need to file a form. The dean would be notified. There would be a review. There would be questions about whether the relationship had been appropriate, whether boundaries had been maintained, whether the academic evaluation had been compromised. He would answer every question honestly. He would tell them that he had fallen in love with her in September and had not touched her until last night. He would tell them that her thesis earned its distinction on its own extraordinary merit. He would tell them that he had done everything right except for one thing, and that one thing was not transferring her supervision when he should have, because he had been too selfish to lose the hour he spent with her every Thursday. They would review the thesis independently. They would see what he had seen. 62 pages of work that stood on its own without his evaluation, without his name attached, without any consideration of what had happened between them. He was not afraid of the review. He was afraid of her waking up and changing her mind. She woke at 7. He felt it before she moved. The bond told him. A shift in her breathing, a change in her scent from the deep, Heavy sweetness of sleep to something brighter, more alert. She stretched against him, her back arching, her body pressing into his, and the warmth of her skin against his chest sent a pulse of heat through him that settled low and heavy. She turned in his arms, faced him. Her eyes were still soft with sleep, green and gold in the morning light, and her hair was a tangled mess of auburn across the pillow, and the bond mark on her neck was dark and vivid, and his. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was rough, low, the most beautiful sound he had heard since the last time she said his name. "Good morning." She studied him. Her eyes moved over his face with the same careful attention she gave to primary sources, reading him, cataloging details. "You did not sleep?" "No."
How long have you been awake? I never fell asleep. Her brow furrowed. Are you okay? I am better than I have ever been in my life. She searched his face for another moment. Then the furrow smoothed, and she smiled, small and certain, and she reached up and touched his jaw. Her fingers traced the line of it, the rough scratch of overnight stubble against her fingertips, and he turned his head slightly and pressed his lips to her palm. You are going to need to show me where the coffee is, he said. She laughed. Right, I did promise that. She got out of bed. She did not reach for clothes. She walked naked across her small apartment, and the morning light from the window hit her body and turned it into something that made his chest physically hurt. The line of her spine, the curve at the base of her back, the freckles scattered across her shoulder blades, the bond mark dark against her pale neck. He watched her from the bed and did not pretend to do anything else. She filled the kettle, set it on the stove, reached into a cabinet for 2 mugs and a jar of instant coffee, and he made a sound that was somewhere between horror and affection. Instant? She looked over her shoulder.
I work 2 jobs and write 60-page theses. I do not have time for a French press. He got out of bed. He crossed the apartment and stood behind her and put his hands on her waist and his chin on the top of her head. She leaned back into him, fit against him perfectly, her body warm and solid and real against his. I am buying you a French press, he said. You are buying me a French press. Today. She turned in his arms, looked up at him. Her expression shifted, something moving behind her eyes that was more serious than coffee. What do we do now, Soren? About the university. I file a disclosure form with the dean's office today. The relationship will be reviewed. Your thesis will be independently evaluated to confirm the grade. She pulled back slightly. You think they will question the grade? I think they will follow procedure. And I think the thesis speaks for itself. Any reviewer in the department will see that. And what about your position? He was quiet for a moment. There may be consequences. I supervised you while developing personal feelings. I should have disclosed or transferred. I did neither. Because of me. Because of both of us. But the decision to keep the supervision was mine. I accept that. She pressed her palms flat against his chest, felt his heartbeat under her hands. I will not let them punish you for this. It is not your fight to have. Her eyes hardened. Something fierce and protective flared in the green. Something omega, the part of her biology that would stand between her alpha and any threat, regardless of the odds. If they try to take your position because you fell in love with someone who is going to stop being your student in a matter of weeks, then yes, it is my fight. I earned that thesis. I earned that grade. And you did nothing wrong, except wait until the right moment to be honest. He looked at her. This woman standing barefoot in her tiny kitchen, hair wild, neck marked, eyes blazing. He kissed her. Not the way he had kissed her last night. This was slower, deeper. The kind of kiss that belonged in the morning light, in the ordinariness of a studio apartment with instant coffee on the counter and the future stretching out ahead of them, uncertain and complicated. And theirs. She melted into it. Her hands slid up his chest and around his neck, and she rose on her toes, and he gathered her closer, and the bond hummed between them, warm and constant. And the kettle began to whistle behind her, and neither of them moved. The water is boiling, she murmured against his mouth. I do not care. She laughed into the kiss. Then she pulled away and turned to the stove, and he stood there, with his hands empty and his chest full,
and watched her pour hot water into 2 mugs of instant coffee with the same precision she applied to everything. They drank it standing up, leaning against the kitchen counter, shoulders touching. It was terrible coffee. He drank every drop. "I have a class at 10, he said. "I have a shift at the bookstore at noon. I will file the disclosure before my class. Can I see you tonight?" She looked at him over the rim of her mug. Her eyes were soft again, the fierceness banked but not gone. "You bonded me, Soren. You do not have to ask if you can see me." He set his mug down, turned to her fully. "I will always ask. The bond does not replace consent. It does not replace choice. You chose me last night, and I am going to spend every day earning that choice again." Her eyes filled. She blinked the tears back and set her mug down and put both hands on his face and pulled him down and kissed his forehead, long and soft, like a benediction. 7 o'clock, she said against his skin. "Bring real coffee." He dressed. He kissed her at the door. He walked to his car in the pale April morning and sat behind the wheel and pressed his forehead to the steering wheel and breathed. Then he drove to campus. The disclosure form was 2 pages long.
He filled it out in his office with the door closed. He wrote the dates precisely, the nature of the supervisory relationship, the date the academic evaluation was submitted and finalized, the date the personal relationship commenced. He noted that no physical contact or explicit verbal expression of personal feelings had occurred during the period of academic supervision. He signed it. He walked it to the dean's office and placed it in the hands of Dean Alderton's administrative assistant. It was done. His 10 o'clock class went as it always did. He lectured. Students took notes. The world continued turning as if everything had not changed. But everything had changed. He could feel her. That was the thing about a bond that no one told you until you had one. It was not telepathy. It was not reading thoughts. It was a low, constant awareness of the other person's emotional state, like a second heartbeat running parallel to your own. He could feel Neve across campus, feel the steadiness of her mood, the slight anxious flutter when she thought about the disclosure, the warmth that spread through the bond when she thought about him. He was thinking about her during his entire lecture. No change there. Dean Alderton called him in at 3. The office was large, wood-paneled, filled with the kind of heavy furniture that suggested authority and permanence. Alderton was a beta in her 60s, sharp-eyed, pragmatic, widely respected. She had been dean for 12 years and had handled every variety of faculty complication the university had produced in that time. She gestured him to a chair. "I have read your disclosure," she said. She did not waste words. He appreciated that. "I have a few questions." "Of course." "You state that no physical contact occurred during the period of supervision." "That is correct." "You state that the personal relationship commenced on the evening of the thesis submission date." "The evening after the thesis had been submitted and graded." "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "And you are telling me that for 8 months, you supervised a student with whom you were developing personal feelings, and you maintained complete professional boundaries the entire time?" "I am telling you exactly that." "Why did you not transfer the supervision?" He met her eyes, did not look away. "Because I found excuses not to. I told myself it was about the quality of her work and my investment in the project. That was true, but incomplete. The complete truth is that I did not want to lose the interaction." She leaned back. "You are aware that this is exactly the kind of admission that creates liability for the university." "I am. I am also aware that the alternative was to lie to you, and I am not going to do that." Silence. Then Alderton nodded. I'm going to order an independent review of the thesis. Standard procedure. Professor Halloran and Professor Sato will evaluate the work without knowledge of your grade. If their evaluations align with yours, the distinction stands. If there is a discrepancy, we will discuss further steps. I expected that. As for you, there will be a formal note in your file regarding the delayed disclosure. No further action at this time. But Soren, she used his first name deliberately. Do not supervise any student with whom you have personal involvement again, not under any circumstances. That will not be a problem. She studied him. Then something in her expression shifted. Not quite a smile, something close. I have been doing this for 12 years, she said. I have seen a lot of faculty disclosures. Most of them are messier than this. Most of them do not involve a professor who sits in my office and tells me the complete truth without flinching. You made a judgment error. You also corrected it at the earliest reasonable moment. That is noted. He nodded. Thank you, Dean Alderton. He stood. He walked to the door. Professor Vask. He turned. Is it a bond? He did not hesitate. Yes. She nodded, something almost warm in her eyes. Congratulations. Now get out of my office. He left. He stopped at a kitchen supply store on the way to Neve's apartment. He bought a French press, whole bean coffee from a small batch roaster, and an electric grinder. He stood in the aisle for 3 minutes deciding between 2 grinders. He was buying a coffee grinder for a woman he had bonded less than 24 hours ago, and it felt like the most important decision of his life. He arrived at her door at 7 with the bags in one hand and coffee beans in the other. She opened the door. She was wearing leggings and one of his shirts. His black button-down from last night, the one she had unbuttoned on his body, and it hung past her thighs, and the sleeves were rolled, and his scent was mixed with hers on the fabric, and the sight of her in his clothes with his bond mark on her neck hit him so hard in the center of his chest that he stopped breathing. She looked at the bags, then at him. You actually bought the French press? I told you I would. She took the bags from him and kissed him, and he followed her inside, and the door closed, and he was home. Not the apartment. Her. She was home. He made the coffee while she sat on the kitchen counter and watched, her legs swinging, her feet bare, his shirt slipping off her shoulder. He ground the beans and boiled the water and pressed the coffee with the same attention to detail he gave to academic papers, and she watched every movement of his hands. You are serious about coffee, she said. I am serious about everything. You have had 8 months to observe this. She laughed. He poured 2 cups and brought one to her, and she wrapped both hands around it and sipped and closed her eyes. Oh. Better than instant? Significantly. He leaned against the counter across from her, drank his coffee, looked at her. I spoke to Dean Alderton today. She set the mug down, her expression sharpened. What happened? He told her. All of it.
The disclosure, the questions, the independent review, the formal note. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. You told her you did not want to lose the interaction. I told her the truth. She deserved it. You told her about the bond. She asked. I was not going to lie about it. Neve set her mug aside and reached for him, and he stepped between her knees, and she wrapped her arms around his neck and pressed her face into his chest and held on. I hate that you have a note in your file because of me. It is a note, not a reprimand, not a sanction. A note. I can live with a note. She pulled back, looked up at him. Her eyes were bright and fierce.
If Halloran and Sato review the thesis and give it anything less than distinction, I will appeal. I will take it to external review. That work is the best thing I have ever written, and I know exactly what it is worth. He traced the line of her jaw with his thumb. They will give it distinction. I have read Halloran's work and Sato's. They will recognize what you did. She exhaled, leaned into his touch. How are you so calm about all of this? Because the hard part is over. The hard part was standing in that library alcove smelling you and walking away. Everything after that is just paperwork. She stared at him. Then she grabbed the front of his shirt and pulled him down and kissed him with a ferocity that knocked the breath out of him. Take this off, she said against his mouth, already pulling at his collar. The coffee went cold on the counter. Neither of them noticed. He let her undress him this time. Let her pull the shirt over his head and press her palms to his chest and push him backward until the backs of his knees hit her bed, and he sat. She stood in front of him, between his knees, and slowly unbuttoned the shirt she was wearing, his shirt, and let it slide off her shoulders and pool on the floor. She was wearing nothing underneath.
He put his hands on her hips. His thumbs traced the hollows there, the small indentations that his fingers fit into perfectly. And she shivered. Sit back, she said. He sat back. She climbed onto the bed, climbed onto him, settled across his lap with her knees on either side of his hips, and the weight of her in his lap, the warmth of her pressed against him, the fall of her auburn hair around both their faces when she leaned down, it all collapsed his breathing. My turn, she said. She kissed him. His mouth, his jaw, the column of his neck, the hollow of his throat where his pulse was hammering. She kissed his collarbones and his chest and the flat space over his heart, and her lips were soft and deliberate, and every press of her mouth left a mark that no one could see, but he could feel. She moved lower. Her mouth traced the hard terrain of his stomach. Her hands gripped his sides. She slid off his lap and onto her knees between his legs and looked up at him with those green eyes and the bond mark dark on her neck, and he gripped the edge of the mattress with both hands. Neve, let me. She lowered her head and took him into her mouth, and his spine arched off the bed, and the sound he made came from somewhere so deep it barely sounded human. She was thorough, attentive. She learned him the way she learned everything, with focus and determination and a refusal to accept anything less than mastery. Her mouth was warm and wet, and her hands were steady, and she found the places that made his breath stutter, and the places that made his hips jerk, and the place that made him grip her hair and say her name in a voice he did not recognize. He pulled her up before he could finish. He needed to be inside her. The need was biological, chemical, the bond demanding completion, but it was also emotional. A need to be connected to her at every possible point. She understood. She climbed back onto his lap. She reached between them and positioned him and sank down, slowly, achingly slowly. And the feeling of her taking him in, the tight, warm, encompassing pressure of her body closing around his, stole every thought from his head. She put her hands on his shoulders. He put his hands on her hips. She began to move. Your thesis is due tomorrow, Omega, she whispered against his ear, and laughed. He groaned. You are never going to let me live that down. Never. It was the most absurd first thing you could have said, and I fell even harder. She moved on him with a rhythm that was entirely her own, rising and falling, her body rolling, her head tipped back, and he watched her face and felt her through the bond, felt her pleasure building, felt the way it intertwined with his own, two frequencies resonating toward the same peak. He held her hips, guided her, matched her rhythm and then changed it, pulling her down harder, deeper, and she gasped, and her fingers dug into his shoulders, and her pace broke and became something urgent and uncontrolled. He rolled them, put her on her back, covered her body with his, drove into her with long, measured strokes that hit something deep inside her that made her voice climb with every thrust. There, right there. Do not stop. He did not stop. He gave her exactly what she asked for, steady and relentless, and her legs wrapped around his waist, and her heels pressed into his lower back, and the sound she was making filled the small apartment, filled his ears, filled the bond. She shattered first. Her back arched and her body clenched around him, and she cried out his name, and her nails scored lines down his arms, and the force of her release triggered his own. He felt the knot swell, felt himself lock inside her, felt the world narrow to the single, blinding point where their bodies met and held, and he poured into her with a groan that broke against her throat. She pulled him closer, wrapped every limb around him, held him while the waves crashed through both of them, shared through the bond, amplified and echoed, until neither of them could tell whose pleasure belonged to whom. They stayed locked together, breathing hard, slick with sweat, his face pressed into the curve of her neck where the bond mark throbbed with fresh heat. "I felt you," she whispered. "Through the bond. I felt everything you felt. I felt you too. Is it always going to be like this?" He lifted his head, looked at her. Her eyes were liquid and dark, and the green was almost gone, swallowed by her blown pupils. "I do not know. I have never been bonded before." She touched his face, traced the line of his cheekbone. "Then we learned together." He turned his head and kissed her palm. They stayed in bed for hours. They did not leave the apartment. She ordered food from the Thai place down the street, and they ate pad see ew from takeout containers, cross-legged on the bed, and he got sauce on his chin, and she wiped it off with her thumb and licked her thumb, and he tackled her back onto the mattress, and the takeout containers went flying, and she shrieked with laughter. He learned that she laughed with her whole body, that she argued about pad see ew versus pad thai with the same intensity she brought to 17th century European history, that she stole the covers and pressed her cold feet against his shins and did not apologize for either. He learned that she was ticklish behind her knees, that she made a specific, small, devastating sound when he kissed the inside of her wrist, that she could not sleep without a glass of water on the nightstand, and that she checked the door lock 3 times before bed. He learned that she was afraid, not of him, not of the bond, of the university, of the review, of the possibility that someone would look at her thesis and see only the relationship and dismiss the work, dismiss her, reduce everything she had accomplished to a footnote about a girl who slept with her professor. She told him this at midnight, lying in the dark with her head on his chest and his hand in her hair. Her voice was steady, but her scent shifted, something sharp and anxious underneath the warmth, and he felt the fear through the bond before she articulated it. "What if they do not see the work?" she said. "What if they only see this? What if everything I built this year gets reduced to a scandal?" He was quiet for a moment, not because he did not have an answer, but because she deserved a real one, not a reflexive comfort. "Then I will make sure the work goes where it belongs regardless. I know 3 journal editors who would review it sight unseen based on the topic alone. Your thesis does not need Ashworth's stamp to prove its value. If the university fails you, we go around the university." She lifted her head, looked at him in the dark. "You would do that?" "I would do anything." She pressed her mouth to his chest, right over his heart, the same spot she had kissed that first night. "I believe you."
The independent review came back 4 days later. Soren was in his office when the email arrived. He opened it, read it once, read it again. Both Halloran and Sato had evaluated the thesis independently. Both had given it the highest possible grade. Halloran had written in her comments that it was one of the most impressive pieces of undergraduate work she had reviewed in 15 years at the institution. Sato had recommended it for publication. He forwarded the email to Navi without adding a word. She called him 11 seconds later. "They recommended it for publication," she said. Her voice was shaking. "Soren, they recommended it for publication." "I know." She was crying. He could hear it through the phone and feel it through the bond, a surge of relief and pride and vindication so powerful it made his own eyes sting. "I told you," he said. "The work speaks for itself. It always did." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Come to the bookstore. I am on my break in 20 minutes. I need to see you."
He was out the door in 30 seconds. He found her in the back alley behind the campus bookstore, sitting on an overturned crate with her phone in her hands and tears on her cheeks and the biggest smile he had ever seen on her face. She saw him and launched herself off the crate and into his arms, and he caught her and lifted her off the ground and held her against his chest, and she buried her face in his neck, and he could feel her laughing and crying at the same time. "I did it," she said into his skin. "You did it." She pulled back, looked at him, touched his face with both hands. "We did it." He kissed her. In the alley behind the bookstore, in the middle of the day, where anyone could see. He did not care. He was finished caring about who saw what. She was his, and he was hers, and the bond mark on her neck was not something he intended to apologize for. A student walked past the alley entrance and stopped and stared. Neve pulled back and looked at the student with an expression so calm and unbothered that it bordered on regal. The student walked away quickly. Soren laughed. The sound surprised him, full and open and unreserved, the kind of laugh he had not made in years. "You just terrified a sophomore," he said. "Good. They will think twice before interrupting." She kissed him again. Then she went back to her shift, and he went back to his office, and for the rest of the afternoon, he could feel her happiness through the bond, bright and steady, and it made every mundane task feel like a celebration. May arrived. The semester wound down. Neve finished her coursework, aced her remaining exams, and confirmed her graduation with honors. She applied to 3 graduate programs and was accepted by all 3 within the first 2 weeks. She chose the one at Ashworth. When she told him, sitting across from him in his apartment over the French press coffee that had become their morning ritual, he stared at her. Ashworth. Ashworth. You were accepted at Cambridge and Columbia. You are choosing Ashworth. She set her mug down, looked at him with clear eyes and no hesitation. I am choosing the program with the best fit for my research area. I am choosing the university that has the primary source archives I need. I am also choosing the city where the man I love lives, and I am not going to pretend that is not part of the decision, because it is. All 3 things are true simultaneously, and none of them diminish the others. He leaned back in his chair, studied her. I do not want you to limit your career for a bond. Her jaw tightened. She put her mug down with a click that was louder than necessary. Do not do that. Do not frame my decision as a sacrifice I am making for you. I spent 3 weeks researching these programs. I spoke to faculty at all 3. I compared archives, funding, faculty expertise, and publication opportunities. Ashworth is the best fit. The fact that my bonded alpha is also on faculty here is a benefit,
not a limitation. Do not diminish my choice by turning it into a concession." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "You are right. I am sorry. You are forgiven. Now pour me more coffee." He poured her more coffee. He watched her drink it with both hands wrapped around the mug and her feet tucked under her on his kitchen chair, and his shirt, another one of his, a gray Henley this time, hanging off her shoulder. He realized he had been collecting these mornings, storing them, each one a small, perfect thing that he held carefully inside himself, a growing archive of moments that proved this was real. She moved into his apartment in June. It was not a dramatic event. She did not have much. Books, mostly. Stacks and stacks of books that invaded every surface of his previously austere apartment and turned it into something that looked lived in and warm and full in a way it had never been when it was just his.
She brought her leather-bound journal and her pen collection and her 3 houseplants that she talked to when she thought he was not listening. She brought the flannel she had been wearing in the library that night, the one that still carried a ghost of her scent from the moment her suppressants failed. And he found it folded in her bottom drawer and held it to his face and breathed in. And she caught him doing it. And the look on her face was so tender it nearly took his knees out. They built a life. That was the only way to describe it. It was not assembled or arranged or planned. It was built, the way you build something with your hands, piece by piece, imperfect and sturdy and real. He cooked. She did not. She made terrible coffee and burnt toast, and once set off the smoke alarm trying to boil eggs, and he stood in the kitchen and laughed until his sides ached while she waved a dish towel at the smoke detector and cursed in a way that was deeply unbecoming of a woman with a distinction-level thesis. She organized his bookshelves. He let her, even though her system made no sense to him, even though she shelved books by subject rather than by author and mixed centuries with gleeful disregard for chronological order. It was her system. It was in his apartment. He loved every misplaced volume. They worked side by side in the evenings, he at his desk reviewing papers, she on the couch with her laptop, and the apartment would be quiet except for the scratch of his pen and the click of her keys, and occasionally one of them would say something, a thought or a question, or a passage that had caught their attention, and the other would respond, and they would talk for 20 minutes and then fall back into productive silence. He had never known it could be like this, that love could be quiet and ordinary and enormous all at the same time. She started her graduate program in September. She was brilliant, as expected. Her advisor, Professor Sato, who had reviewed her undergraduate thesis and recommended it for publication, told Soren at a faculty meeting that Neve was the most promising doctoral student he had supervised in a decade. Soren felt pride so fierce it was almost indistinguishable from pain. She was going to be extraordinary. She already was. A year passed. Then 2. She published her first paper, then her second. She presented at a conference in Vienna, and he went with her and sat in the back of the room and watched her command a lecture hall the way he had watched her command his attention from the 4th row of his own class. And he felt the bond pulse with her nervous energy, and then with her confidence as she found her stride, and then with her fierce, quiet triumph when the applause came. He was sitting in the hotel room that night, reading on the bed, when she came out of the bathroom and stood in front of him in nothing but a hotel robe and said, "I want to tell you something." He set the book down. "I am pregnant." The world stopped. He looked at her. She was standing very still, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes bright and watchful, waiting for his reaction. The bond surged. He felt everything she was feeling, the joy and the fear and the hope and the uncertainty. And underneath all of it,
A new presence, faint and formless but undeniably there, a third note in the chord that had been only two. He stood. He crossed the room. He put his hands on her face and looked into her eyes and said the only word his mouth could form. When? 7 weeks. I took the test this morning. I wanted to tell you in person. I wanted to see your face. She was searching his expression, reading him the way she read everything, with precision and hunger. What are you feeling? She asked. He kissed her, long and deep and trembling. Then he pulled back and pressed his forehead to hers and said, terrified, ecstatic, both at the same time, in equal measure. She laughed.
It was wet and shaky and real. Same. He dropped to his knees, right there on the hotel room carpet, the same way he had dropped to his knees in her studio apartment the first night. And he pressed his mouth to her stomach through the robe, and he felt her hands in his hair and her tears on his forehead when she bent over him, and the bond was singing, singing. 3 notes now instead of 2. We are going to need a bigger apartment, he said against the terry cloth. She laughed through her tears. We are going to need a lot of things. He stood. He gathered her into his arms. He held her the way he had held her that first night, the way he had held her every night since, completely and without reservation. I love you, he said. I have loved you since the Peace of Augsburg. And I am going to love this child with the same totality and the same certainty. And I am going to be the kind of father who is present and steady and there, because that is what you deserve, and what this child deserves, and what I want more than anything I have ever wanted except you. She put her hands on his face, looked at him with those green eyes, gold-flecked and full. I know, she said. I have always known. She kissed him. He lifted her. She wrapped her legs around his waist and her arms around his neck, and he carried her to the bed and laid her down, and the robe fell open, and she was glowing, literally glowing, her skin flushed and warm and alive, and he put his mouth on every inch of her that he could reach. He worshipped her body that night with even more reverence than the first time, knowing what it was doing, knowing what it was becoming, knowing that the woman underneath him was building a new life inside herself, and that he had helped make it, and that this, all of this, the bond and the love and the future growing in her belly, had started with a scent in a library at midnight. He tasted her until she came twice, her hands in his hair, her hips rising off the hotel mattress, her voice breaking on his name in the dark of a Vienna hotel room 2,000 miles from the library where they had found each other. Then she pulled him up, and he entered her slowly, carefully, and they moved together in a rhythm that was patient and deep and full of something that felt bigger than both of them. Your thesis is due tomorrow, Omega, she whispered against his ear. He laughed into her neck, and she laughed into his, and they held each other and moved together, and the world was quiet and warm and complete. Afterward, lying in the dark, her back against his chest, his hand resting on her stomach where something new and miraculous was beginning, she said his name. Soren. Thank you for following my scent through the library stacks. He pressed his mouth to the bond mark on her neck, the mark that had been there for 2 years and still made her shiver every time he kissed it. Thank you for letting your suppressants fail. She laced her fingers through his where they rested against her belly. My body chose right. He held her tighter. Outside the hotel window, Vienna glittered. Somewhere across the continent, the Ashworth University Library stood dark and quiet, its shelves holding 2 million volumes. And somewhere in the medieval history section, on the 3rd floor,
In the last study carol of the back alcove, the air still carried the ghost of a scent. Warm vanilla, rain-soaked earth, something sweeter underneath. The scent of an omega who had been found by the only alpha who mattered. The scent of a love story that started with a thesis and ended with a heartbeat. The scent of home.